Immanuel Kant. I'm sure you've heard of his name before. Very famous and influential philosopher that started a school of thought called German idealism. And we kind of talked about what that was, but essentially he was trying to combine rational ways of acquiring knowledge with experiential ways of gaining knowledge. So he was trying to reconcile the two schools of thought that were prominent at the time that seemed to be kind of almost contradicting each other in a way. And as a context, he was a Prussian philosopher, and he grew up in a very religious family following a branch of Lutheranism. He was, I guess, stereotypical German. He lived a very strict and ordered life. Germans have a stereotype for being very punctual, orderly. A funny story about him was that he used to go on these daily walks, and because he was so strict and ordered, he would go on walks at exactly the same time. To the point where the neighbors would actually set their clocks based on his daily walks. So that's the kind of guy he was. He grew up in a religious family, and he was very ordered and very strict about the way he went about his life. And despite having a lot of strong religious influence in his upbringing, he was a quite inquisitive person. He was trying to understand the world without having to rely on God so much. And one of the first examples of this is an earthquake that happened in Lisbon in 1755. And a lot of the times, back then, natural disasters were explained by God's anger being brought upon to humanity. Essentially, that was the explanation. But he really tried to explain the earthquake without using God. So he was already at that point moving away from relying on God as an explanation for everything. So this is a little sudden, but what do you guys think about free will? Do we have free will? What is freedom? How would you define freedom? There's no right answers. But I guess it's hard to deny that there's a cause and effect in this world. If you have certain experiences, you're more predisposed to lead a certain life. I think a good example of this is people from different socioeconomic statuses. If you're from a very low socioeconomic status, then you're less likely to be able to get good education. You might mingle with people who might be committing crimes, and you might end up leading that path, right? So let's say, for an example, there was a child, right? A boy born into poverty. The child's family can't afford good education. He starts to commit crime to, I guess, be able to eat. Maybe this escalates to more violent crimes, and he goes to prison. So who's at fault? Is it the person, or is it society/environment? Is it society's fault for not having a system in place to be able to support this person? Which one is it? It's not easy to reconcile these two perspectives because essentially they're arguing for two completely different things, right? If the person says it's the person's fault, that's suggesting that the person has free will. If someone says that it's the society's fault or the environment's fault, then you're suggesting this person has no free will. What they're arguing for is different, right? One party's saying the fault is with the person because they're ultimately capable of making decisions for themselves, and they decided to go down this path of crime and violence. The other party is saying that this person actually doesn't have free will. Society and his situation plays a more significant role in shaping the kind of person that they will become. The child, technically, right? Maybe they could decide to take a different path. The child could have gone to a library if they wanted to, right? If they made that decision, they could have gone to a library, gotten education there, especially with the age of the internet and being able to access computers in libraries. You basically have access to all the education that you would need. But at the same time, if they're in this situation, it's going to be more difficult for them. But if it was always the society's fault, then all the people that were born into poverty would be committing crimes or going down a similar path of being social outcasts. But there are cases where people that are born in poverty are able to climb out of that and really make a name for themselves, contribute in a profound manner to society. So there's more at play here than just society influencing the outcome. So there's truth to both sides, but they're both contradicting each other because one's saying no free will and the other thing is saying free will. Kant tries to reconcile this by thinking about the world in this way. He suggests that we're actually going back and forth in between a world of cause and effect, and there's another world of free will. he suggests that we actually kind of straddle these two worlds, and that humans have the capacity to break out of the world of cause and effect. That's the main world that we're in. We're controlled by our external circumstances, but by exercising our free will, we have the capacity to kind of break out of that current and move into the free will world. So humans have ability to exercise their will. Despite having the potential, humans have the potential to exercise their free will, we might not think we have the capacity to do that. Kant suggests that we all do have the capacity to be able to exercise that free will, but not everyone is fully aware of it or has the awareness to be able to exercise that. So then I guess that brings me to my next point. So what does dignity mean? Essentially what dignity means is right of a person to being worthy of honor or respect. When you're interacting with a person, do you feel that humans have dignity? I think intuitively, when we think about another person, and this can also be, because we're living in an age where a lot of the ideals are influenced by the Enlightenment era. So, the era that Kant and the modern day philosophers kind of kickstarted. But a lot of things that we value today are things like universal human rights, values of democracy, right, equality, those things. And those can be traced back to Enlightenment era concepts. So I'm sure there's a lot of influence from that era. Maybe if you ask a person in the United States in like the 1800s or 1700s, when owning a slave was a very common thing, maybe they would have answered in a different way. But to us, when we think about other human beings, intuitively we feel that they have dignity. Or you might not feel that other animals have dignity. Maybe you feel that certain pets have dignity, but it's kind of hard to kind of draw the line. Would you say animals have dignity? Would you say insects have dignity? Where would you draw the line, and why do humans have dignity? And why do we feel that certain animals have dignity? And why do we feel that other animals don't have dignity? At the end of the day, it is kind of hard to draw a line on which animals have self-awareness too, right? Like for all we know, a lot of the animals could be just being fully controlled by their biology. They might be, in a sense, like a robot that doesn't have self-awareness but moves through the world because of their pre-programming. It's possible, right? It's hard to know what animals are self-aware. We can't ask them. If we could communicate with them, we could, I guess, better understand if they are self-aware or not. But to give you what Kant says, his opinion is that people have dignity because humans have the ability to exercise free will. They have autonomy, right? Because they have autonomy and they have the ability to exercise their free will, then their rights should be respected. Their ability to be able to kind of craft their own life with their free will should be respected. So that's kind of where he draws the line. Kant says that's the distinguishing characteristic of human beings. This is my take. I think Kant, especially as religious influence was starting to wane, before we could argue that humans are chosen, humans were special because we're chosen by God. But because that explanation was starting to lose its influence, he's trying to figure out a way to distinguish animals from humans. What makes humans special? Why do humans have dignity? Why should human rights be respected? He's trying to think of ways to be able to explain this. The conclusion he comes to is that it is the ability to exercise the free will that really distinguishes humans from animals. But at the end of the day, that's his take, right? So we don't need to necessarily agree with that. So dignity kind of ties into Kant's worldview in that because humans can straddle between the world of cause and effect and the world of free will and freedom, humans have dignity. I don't know if you guys are satisfied by that, but that's kind of his take and how free will connects with dignity and human rights. Is freedom important to you? How much do you guys value freedom? Yeah, so that's a difficult thing, right? We all have different definitions of freedom. Freedom is definitely being able to express yourself freely, doing what your heart desires, maybe even keep caving into some of your desires, right? But a lot of the times if we binge watch YouTube or drink too much, we don't feel good. So being able to exercise your freedom doesn't necessarily mean, good consequences. So now that we discussed that, right? Freedom is very important to all of us. But let's imagine a world where there's a authoritarian leader. He controls every aspect of society. He's monitoring everything. You have to submit your fingerprint. You gotta submit your DNA. Maybe they can even keep a track of your browsing records on the internet. They know exactly what you're doing every moment. But if you follow let's just assume this leader is benevolent. If you follow exactly what he has set out for you, you'll have a very fruitful life, very safe, and a prosperous life. Would you take that? Would that be something that you would sign up for? Within that society, there's no murder because everything is controlled. Maybe you have to pursue a certain career path because that's what the authoritarian leader wants you to do. But everyone's safe, there's no violence, and people are living, there's no poverty, people are able to stay healthy. Would you take that? Would you exchange your freedom for that? I think it's always a trade-off, right? We do give away freedom by, for having extra safety or peace of mind. We hand over authority to police, for example. They can take away your freedom, or take away freedom of other people to kind of maintain more social order. There's laws in place, right? Those things restrict our freedom. But at the same time, it kind of gives society more structure, more order, and there's less chaos because of those restrictions, right? So there's going to be more chaos if there's freedom because people will get to do what they want to do, right? It's an exchange, right? So that's kind of how we think about freedom. And it seems like we have a consensus. Freedom is very important to us, especially if you're living in a democratic country with, a high degree of freedom. That's kind of a core value in our society. I'm assuming most of you are from democratic countries that have a certain, a pretty high level of freedom, especially if you're able to access the internet, and if you're able to if you're here, you're on the internet on a live stream talking to a random dude from Canada speaking about philosophy. So you probably have a lot of freedom, and it would make sense that you value freedom because you're born in that society. So that's kind of our intuitive thought, right? Freedom is being able to kind of freely express yourself and have autonomy. Kant's way of thinking about freedom is kind of similar, but he argues that freedom is actually more closely related to discipline. I guess his way of thinking about freedom is kind of similar to autonomy. He argues that, behaving based on, more primitive desires is actually not freedom because you're stuck in the world of cause and effect. So it kind of ties in with his worldview of the world being split into two, right? There's the world of cause and effect and the world of free will. He is arguing that the world of free will consists of you kind of overcoming your, more primitive desires, such as trying to benefit on a personal level, or the desire to kind of de-stress by binge watching YouTube, etc. So that's kind of his view of freedom. An example would be, let's say on a Friday evening, you're feeling tired, you just got back from work, your more short-term desires telling you, let's just go have a drink, eat some potato chips and whatnot. But the more self-disciplined side of you would argue you would feel better about yourself if you go to the gym. If you're able to kind of behave based on the more higher level desires or the more disciplined side of yourself, then that kind of connects to freedom. I think the distinction that he's trying to make is what makes humans unique, right? And because he came to the conclusion that, exercising free will is a uniquely human ability, a lot of the times that would entail overcoming maybe more short-term desires or impulses. And oftentimes animals aren't able to do that. The ability to do so is what defines free will and freedom in Kant's eyes. Based on this, he then kind of continues into trying to define what act becomes ethical. So freedom is pretty important in Kant's eyes because it ties in closely with ethics. And he argues that when humans exercise free will, as in they're able to kind of move into the world of free will and away from the world of cause and effect, that behavior is ethical. Any behavior that is undertaken through free will is ethical. Any thoughts on why Kant might think this? Kant would argue that free will in and of itself is ethical. This is my interpretation. The reason why he pushes so much for freedom and being able to exercise free will being an ethical behavior is because we go back to the idea about how free will is core essence of what it means to be a human being. So by exercising that free will, you're kind of living up to your potential perhaps, or you are exercising your ability to be a human being. When you give away freedom, on the other hand, you're kind of giving up something that is fundamental to being a human. So that's why it is unethical, because that is the line that divides humans with animals. So we kind of go back to this idea, right? We talked about how the child that was born into poverty, we had one group of people say it's the society's fault, right? And one group of people that argued it was the person's fault. And we tied it into how if it's the person's fault, it's because humans have free will. If it's the society's fault, then it's because humans have no free will. So Kant would never argue that something that is deemed good by society is automatically ethical behavior. He would put more emphasis on whether the person exercised their free will. We definitely take freedom for granted, and there's no doubt that we value freedom, but it is also true that it's a trade-off, right? We do give away freedom for the purpose of social order. We don't really spend that much time thinking about what freedom is because, especially if we already have access to a lot of freedom, we don't really need to think about it on a regular basis. But Kant's interpretation is an interesting one for sure. Hope that was stimulating. Again, there's no right or wrong. This is just one idea of what is ethical, what is good, what it means for humans to have free will or freedom.